So we're finally ready to start talking about the next major phase in human society and the development of human societies. And that's when we finally start settling down and becoming farmers, or we start becoming agriculturalists. Everything that we've talked about so far, we've really been talking about the we've been really talking about humans as hunter-gatherers. We've been talking about how we roam around the landscape and we're foraging and we're trying we're we're hunting wild animals and collecting wild plants. And maybe we're doing some light scale cultivation. Maybe our ancestors, in the context we've talked about, like in the Mesolithic and in parts of North America, were starting to dabble with agriculture. But it's really not until about 10 to 12,000 years ago that we really start to settle down in certain parts of the world and say, well, let's start growing our own artificial food supply. So the purpose of today's class is to talk about this origins of agriculture. And today we're going to mostly talk about it from an actual like plant perspective. So we're actually going to talk about how this process happened, where it happened, and what kinds of plants and animals were being domesticated. On Thursday, or no, Tuesday, that'll be a Tuesday. I guess, calendar's crazy. On Tuesday, we're going to be focusing on the Neolithic, which is the cultural period that we refer to as the earliest period of agriculture. And we're going to talk more about like the cultural elements and some of the social and cultural changes that occur because of agriculture. But today it's all about the actual form of domestication. And so in this first lecture, we're just going to talk about some basics of domestication. How does it happen? What kinds of traits do we look for? And then we'll talk more specifically about some of the prehistoric origins of domestication in later lectures. So the first thing I want to recognize and point out, though, is that the systematic cultivation of plants to create an artificial food supply is not instinctive to human culture. Because we're agriculturalists today, we like to think that all humans are instinctively agriculturalists and that people only hunt and gather because they're too dumb or whatever to grow their own food supply. That's not true. One of the big things to recognize is that plant animal domestication has only been practiced for less than 1% of the time our genus has existed. Our genus, Homo, has probably been around for about 2.6 to 3 million years. We've only been farming for about 10,000 of those years. So we first have to recognize that this agricultural thing that humans started doing is very strange and very weird because we were perfectly fine for millions of years being hunter-gatherers. So this is not inevitable. It did not have to happen, but it did happen. And we're going to talk about some of the reasons why that happened. But don't go into this thinking like, well, this is just the next inevitable stage of human evolution, because it's very much not. A lot of the times this happened because of like crazy random happenstance and then accelerated so quickly that there was no way to go back to hunting and gathering societies. When we talk about human domestication of plants and animals, there are really two weird things that stand out that we should be aware of. First is that humans have only cultivated a few genera of plants and animals. If you think about all of the plants and animals that exist in the world, and then you picture how many are actually available to eat at like your local grocery store, it's not a lot. We eat a relatively small number of plants and animals, particularly animals. We do eat a wide variety of plants, but not if you think about how many plants actually exist out there in the world. And we're going to talk about later on Tuesday how this is actually kind of an issue and how humans actually have worse nutrition when they become agriculturalists because they are focused on such a much narrower amount of food than they had before. And the second thing to recognize is that agriculture will be developed independently in many different parts of the world. And we'll talk about this later as well. A lot of the times we associate agriculture with Mesopotamia, the Near East, the Fertile Crescent, all of that. And that's true. That's probably where it first appeared. But people are going to independently invent agriculture in 6 or 7 different places around the globe. So the Mesopotamians of the Fertile Crescent are not the only people that have domesticated plants and animals, but many other people have invented it on their own later. So before we can get into anything else, let's just cover some definitions so that we're all on the same page. So when we refer to agriculture, we're talking about human efforts to modify the environments of plants and animals to increase their productivity and usefulness. This can take a lot of different forms. It can be things like weeding, hoeing, watering plants, fashioning scarecrows, building pens and other shelters for your animals. It can include using fertilizer, more recently, things like pesticides. It's pretty much anything to get more food produced for the amount of labor that you're putting in. So agriculture is doing anything to modify the environment in order to get more productive food out of your animals and your plants, right? And this definition is relative. Early times when we're talking about early agriculture, we're really talking about like some light weeding and some light hoeing and, you know, maybe building some shelters for your animals. But today, when we talk about agriculture, we're referring to modern mechanized agriculture. We're talking about huge machinery, lots of money, lots of pesticides, lots of fertilizer, genetically modified plants. We are talking about like a very modern form of agriculture when we refer to it in like the 21st century. So it's a relative term. It can refer to just, you know, what you're doing out in your garden if you have a backyard garden, and it can refer to like the mega farms and the mega mechanized agriculture that we see. So agriculture refers to all of that. When we talk about domestication, we're talking about the process of changing the physical characteristics of plants and animals. And in particular, this refers to the changing of these physical characteristics in at least two ways. One is that we're changing the physical characteristics in order to be more useful for humans. So maybe this is growing strawberries that are bigger, right? Maybe this is growing corn that has more kernels on it, and so it has a lot more food. It could be changing the physiology and anatomy of dogs to make them less dangerous and less strong and less wild than wolves. So it's really changing those physical characteristics in order to get what we want out of them. Fatter chickens, fatter pigs, sweeter fruits, bigger vegetables. You know, maybe we're looking for more vibrant vegetables, more nutritious fruits and vegetables, et cetera, et cetera. The second major thing about domestication that's important here is that in most cases, domestication is going to make it so that an animal or plant cannot live without human intervention. So while we might have dogs in the wild and things, dogs today are not designed to live in the wild like wolves are. And domesticated dogs and cats are not always super successful outside of human contexts. A lot of domesticated plants could not grow in the wild because they require the tending of humans. So while these fruits and vegetables are now more nutritious and they're bigger and we get more out of them, they will die unless we're there to harvest them because they've lost all of those natural seed dispersing elements, et cetera, and other things. And we'll talk more about that in detail in just a minute. But it's important to know that in most cases, domestication makes it so that the plant or animal cannot live without human intervention. And then finally, when people refer to cultivation, they're referring to the growing of plants from seeds, bulbs, shoots, and so on. And so essentially, when people talk about the cultivation of plants from an archaeological perspective, they're just saying like, did you plant something and did it grow? Sometimes, you know, this is obviously a part of domestication in agriculture. In most cases, agriculture is going to involve the planting of seeds, bulbs, or shoots. But what we also see and is also possible is that people early on, particularly like in the Mesolithic, they may have planted seeds. They may have planted bulbs, and they would have done so in a very light scale way in which they're not doing it very often, but they are doing it. And so some of these early people are practicing cultivation. They are planting seeds and bulbs and things and so on, but they're not performing agriculture because they're not really doing much else to grow this food. So cultivation is a part of agriculture. Cultivation can exist independently of agriculture. And it's probably the first thing people were doing. The first ways that people probably first really started thinking about agriculture is like they would go and they would, you know, have to use the bathroom and they would poop out any kind of seeds that they had consumed because through the eating of fruits and vegetables. And they would have noticed that these plants would have started growing. And then people would have realized like, oh, it's because of the seeds. And then they would have started growing those seeds a little bit. And then that would slowly start to snowball. So these early days, we were doing cultivation, but not full scale agriculture quite yet. And then finally, it's this, I want to talk about this idea of mutualism. And this is just the idea that domestication is a co-evolutionary process, meaning that when we as humans domesticate plants and animals, we interfere and intervene with the life cycles of those species. So we are artificially selecting particular traits and particular genes that we like because they suit us. So we are causing these plants to evolve and change because of our preferences. This isn't natural selection, it's artificial selection because we are picking and choosing which plants get to reproduce and which plants don't, and which different strains we're going to cross and what we're going to breed, et cetera, et cetera. And over time, each subsequent generation is going to be more intimately associated with humans. So they're going to become more and more dependent on us as they become less adapted to their natural environments. That's one thing, and this is what I was trying to get at earlier when I was talking about domestication. As we continue to kind of mess around and play around with plant and animal genes, we're making them less adaptable to their environments. Dogs are much less adapted to wild woods and things like that than wolves are. We did that to them, right? So on one hand, we're influencing them, we're influencing their evolution, but they're also influencing our evolution. And this is why we call it a co-evolutionary process. Just like we are artificially selecting for certain traits from them, they're causing us to change our genes and our mutations and things as well. The best example of this is probably lactose intolerance. A lot of people were, prior to the Neolithic, the entire human population was lactose intolerant. Nobody before the Neolithic could digest milk sugars after they've grown up and were no longer a baby. Today, a lot of people can drink milk and have no problems with it. They are lactose tolerant. Their reason for that is because we have consumed a lot of milk products after we domesticated cows and goats and other animals. That actually changed us. That changed our evolution because now all of a sudden we have genes that allow us to digest milk sugars. So while we domesticated and artificially selected for those cows and those goats and other animals that gave us milk, they've artificially selected for us as well and changed our evolution. So that's why we say domestication is a co-evolutionary process. Both humans and animals and plants are changing. So having known that, let's look at a few things about how we decide which kinds of plants and animals we decide to domesticate. I said earlier that one of the weird things about human agriculture is that we've actually domesticated a very small number of plant and animal species, particularly when considering how many plants and animals exist in the world. This is because when it comes to domestication, humans have to select for certain traits. And they're looking for plants and animals that already naturally have certain things that are going to make them really useful for humans. We're going to intensify those traits through artificial selection, but we're looking for plants and animals that are already pretty easy to do that. We don't want to work from like 0. We want to work from, 50% there. We don't want to work from 0% there. So the first thing that humans look for when deciding if they want to domesticate a plant species is we look at their dormancy cycles. We want plants that have short, productive, and predictable growing seasons. We want to know that a plant is going to always bloom and produce fruit in the spring or in the summer or in the fall or whatever. That's why whenever you go to the grocery store and you say, oh, this fruit or vegetable is in season, we look for plants that have that particular in-season growth cycle. We want it so that we can predict it, so that we know what food we're going to have over the year. We also want this to be pretty short. We want seeds that'll germinate very quickly. We want it so that if we plant you in the ground, within a few days or weeks or at max a few months, we're going to start producing food. We don't want those kinds of seeds, and some plants are like this. where we don't like it where it's going to take years before a seed will germinate. And some plant species, it takes a really long time for seeds to germinate. We want you to grow quickly. We want you to produce food because if possible, we want to get multiple cycles of crops out of a plot of land within the same year in order to ensure that we are growing enough food. So we're not looking for things with very long growth cycles. This is one of the reasons that we don't really see trees and orchards appearing until pretty late in prehistory. Because very early on, people were like, I don't want to, like, it takes forever for trees to actually start producing fruit. We're not looking for those. We're looking for short, productive, and predictable growing seasons. The second is we want to look at their dispersal mechanism. And what this means is that most plants have some way of dispersing their seeds naturally. You know, plants don't reproduce like animals. You know, it's not like you walk up to another being, have sex with it, and then move on. Instead, what we get is that a lot of the times they'll release their seeds and spread them out, and then wind and rain and water will spread them. Other animals, as it catches in their fur and things, will spread those seeds around, and that'll allow for the plant to continue to disperse. We don't like this. We don't want seeds that disperse easily in the wind or in water. So indehiscence is this concept that we do not want seeds in other parts of the plants to open up and scatter once the plant becomes fully grown and the fruit becomes ripe, right? We want plants in which we physically have to go up and pull the seeds and other parts of the plant off. Because let's say you're growing in a field and you have your farm and you have everything lined up really, really nicely. You don't want the seeds just dispersing at random and then fucking up your perfectly organized garden, right? You don't want things at random. And you also don't want this if this is a plant where you eat the seeds, because then you're just wasting the food supply. So one of the examples we can look at this is what we call non-shattering wheat. So wheat is naturally like what we see on the left-hand side here, which is that wheat naturally releases its seeds as it grows and it ripens, and those disperse. We don't like this. One, because this is the part of the wheat plant that we eat, that we process and we turn into things like bread and flour and oatmeal, et cetera, et cetera. We want what's on the right. We want non-shattering wheat. This wheat will not disperse unless a human actually goes in and through force plucks these off and processes them. We like this because it's predictable. It's something that we can control, and that's what we want, right? So one of the things is that we're looking for plants that have a dispersal mechanism that works in our favor. This is another example of domestication because we have non-shattering wheat now, wheat could not survive without us. If we just let wheat do its thing and we stop doing anything with it, domesticated wheat would die out as a species because it has no way to reproduce because it's non-shattering. We also look for large seeds. This is the case because large seeds are easier to work with. They are easier to pick, they're easier to plant. And for things like pumpkins and gourds and things especially in the Americas, they're easy to eat. So we're looking for plants that have very large seeds if possible. And part of what we're going to do through artificial selection in a lot of plants is make those seeds larger and larger and larger. And then in the very modern world, it's weird because now we don't want those seeds. So now we have things like watermelons and things that are seedless because now we find that they get in the way. But for most of domestication, prehistoric peoples wanted larger seeds because they're easier to work with and easier to eat. And then the fourth thing that we're looking for is we're looking for plants that have very limited physical or chemical defenses because this makes them a lot easier to harvest and to consume. And at the end of the day, being edible is a key trait for pretty much all domesticated plants. Not all. There are some domesticated plants that we use for like rope and twine and things like that we don't eat. But for the most part, we're going to be eating any plant that we domesticate. And we're either eating it as food or consuming it as medicine. We don't want to domesticate things like poison ivy because poison ivy has a pretty intense chemical defense mechanism. We're not going to mess with that. So we're looking for plants that are easy to domesticate and easy to eat because they have very little physical or chemical defenses. And there are a lot of plants out there that have limited physical chemical defenses. A lot of plants out there, particularly the ones that we domesticated, want to be eaten. A lot of plants out there want their fruits to be consumed in the wild because when an animal consumes that plant and then it poops out the seeds, that's a dispersal mechanism. So there are plenty of plants out there that have limited physical and chemical defenses. We're looking for those ones. So with all of that in mind, some of the earliest plant domesticates that we get are things like wheat, barley, millet. These are all really, really great plant kinds because things like einkorn are weed resistant. They don't need a lot of nitrogen or other kind of nutrients in the soil. Emmer wheat has a very unique ability to survive in different conditions, and it doesn't really absorb a lot of nutrients from the soil either. Things like barley are really good for like dry soils, so you don't need a lot of water. And barley is also really good for like European colder climates. Millet's the same way. So you don't need to know the details of these, but if you think about it, like if you can just say wheat, barley, millet, those are some of those early plant domesticates. And the reason is that they're pretty easy to grow. They meet all the requirements we talked about earlier. They don't need a lot of care. They aren't really meaty plants. So they don't need a lot of nutrients. They don't need a lot of water. They don't need really ideal growing conditions, which makes them really good for us. Also, because you can boil it, turn it into a stew or an oatmeal, you can bake, you could eventually bake them into bread, even though most people early on are not doing that. There's a lot that you can do with these plants. Similarly to how we have particular things we're looking for in plants, we also have things that we're looking for in animals. So the first of these is that they're herdable and that they are naturally accustomed to living within a hierarchical social system. So we're looking for animals in which they are already used to following the lead of another. So think about wolf packs. Wolf packs have that kind of that alpha, beta, whatever mentality. So they're already used to one individual being the leader in the group or a group of individuals being the leaders. That's what we like about dogs. And that's why it was really easy to domesticate dogs because we just turned ourselves into the alpha. And dogs are already used, or dogs through their wolf ancestry are already used to following us, others around. So they're really easy to keep it within this hierarchical social system. Other animals are very similar. Most pack animals like cows, they have a similar social system, and that makes them very herdable. They're used to living in groups, and in most cases, these animals are non-territorial. So they're fine living with other animals, and they're fine living in the presence of humans. If cows, for example, were super territorial and didn't want to live with other cows, it would be really hard to have a dairy farm. Chickens, it'd be really hard if one of the chickens decided it didn't want to fuck with or mess with any other chickens. So we're looking for these animals that have have these nice temperaments, that are not aggressive, that aren't going to attack us, that are not easily panicked. They're fine living with humans and other members of their own species and even different species, and that we can control very, very easily. Another thing we're looking for is that animals are herbivorous. We're looking for animals that eat plants. The reason for this is that carnivores are likely to eat us, and we're not looking for any animal that's going to be dangerous. And also, carnivores on the whole are pretty hard to feed. It's easy to just throw whatever slop you've got and whatever like leftover plant material you've got to your cow or to your chickens. It's really hard if we were like domesticating a tiger to produce enough meat, because meat is really expensive to quote unquote grow, because animals are a lot harder to raise. They take a much longer time, and the meat yield is much lower than, say, growing a field of wheat. So we're not looking for carnivores. And any carnivores that we do domesticate are animals that can pretty much feed and fend for themselves. The domesticated cat is a carnivore, but the cat, we really domesticated it to keep pests and other things away from the barns and the farmhouse. And so we're like, yeah, we're going to domesticate you and you're a carnivore, but we're not really in charge of feeding you. We're just going to create the conditions in which mice and shit appear, and then you can get to eat. We're also looking for rapid maturation rates. So we want the animal to grow and reach sexual maturity relatively quickly. We need them to be able to breed in captivity. Some animals will only breed in the wild. It's one thing that zoos always deal with. We don't want any animal to be problematic when we want to produce more of that animal. We want them to breed happily within their pens and their barns and things like that. So pandas will never be domesticated. And also, if they can be the source of both food and non-food products, that's great. While we're always looking for meat, anything that can give us more than meat, like milk and milk products, that's great. But also looking at things like sheep that can give us wool and other things like that. So being able to give us multiple products is a really great plus when we're looking for animals. So if we're looking at some of the earliest domesticated animals here, the dog was domesticated back in the Mesolithic about 12,000 years ago. At the beginning of the Neolithic, so some of these early agricultural domesticated animals include sheep, goats, and pigs. Cattle are going to appear around 8,000 years ago. Slightly later is going to be the horse and the donkey. There's going to be an attempt to do water buffalo at 6,000 years ago, where they're going to be domesticated for a little bit. We kind of give that up because they're kind of big and unruly and kind of mean. The llama and the alpaca in South America become domesticated around 5,500 years ago, and then camels in the desert around 4,500 years ago. So these are some of the major species. So you can see that, really early on, we're interested in the dog because they're good for hunting, and then sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle because of all the things they can give us. So that's all I've got for you right here. In the next lectures, we're going to start talking a little bit about how this actually happened in prehistory, how we actually got to the point of domestication, and then we're going to talk a little more specifically about how that happened in different parts of the world.